So who are the meanest and greenest orcs in the codex? Let's find out with a look at some of the strongest orcs in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking orcs once more, and today I thought we'd do a bit of an overview of current trends in orcs armies, covering some of the strongest and hottest units in Arks of Omen. In general, the greenskins have been doing fairly well in 40k's latest season. They got a few nice points drops to a bunch of good units, their objective rules improved a little bit, and I think that Armour of Contempt helped out by them going away for good, making a lot of their base units just a little bit more threatening, everything armed with choppers in particular. At the moment, most lists tend to be very melee focused, usually Goths, occasionally Death Skulls, and almost entirely built around melee. Shooting units aren't doing quite so well, but at least with their more optimised builds, they do tend to be doing pretty well in tournaments, around about a 53% win percentage, which isn't too bad as 40k goes. They have won a few grand tournaments, and I was pretty interested to see which units people were using to get these good results. In this video, I thought we'd take a bit of a data-driven look at what units are doing well in Orcs lists at the moment, and with that in mind, I've taken a look at 25 high-performing Orcs army lists, anything that either went 4 or 1 or better at a grand tournament, or 3-0 at a local smaller event. This will select for the Orcs armies that are actually doing quite well, generally ones that tend to be taking their best selections and played by good players. And I feel like the amount of lists that use certain units is a really good metric to see what's competitive at the moment, what's an auto-include for the best Orc armies around, and what's a bit more questionable or just isn't run at all. Obviously just one way to look at things, but quite a helpful one in my opinion. We'll go through the top 10 Orc units that are picked in most competitive lists at the moment, and also look at a few honourable mentions for some near misses. Jumping straight into it, these are the units in the codex that were taken a fairly respectable amount of times, but have missed out on the top selections. There really are quite a lot of units in Codex Orcs that just aren't really being run at the moment. Unfortunately, just not a lot of players are running bikes, buggies or deathcopters. With all the buffs to the War, the speed War just seems fairly neglected. The Orc Super Heavies weren't making any sort of appearance either in these top armies. No Gorkanauts or Morkanauts despite their points cuts, and there wasn't very much use of certain support characters like Painboys or quite a lot of the Orky special characters. Looters, Flashkits and Tank Busters were similarly unpopular. The things that narrowly missed out on the top 10 though, a few lists took killer cans with their new cheaper points cut. They do get you a lot of ramshackle wounds on the table for cheap now. Mega Nobz are fairly popular jumping out of transports, as are Burner Boys, a bit of an interesting close range anti-infantry deal. Mech guns were taken in a few armies and at least are fairly popular. I feel like they might be slightly hamstrung by Arks of Omen detachment rules though. There is competition for those heavy slots with things like kill rigs and battle wagons. Only very narrowly outside the top 10, 8 lists took either Ghazghkull, Boss Zagstruk, or the Knob on the Smasher Squig. Ghazghkull seems to be decently strong, though not auto-include for every army, a massive melee powerhouse that can't die in any one turn. Definitely a problem unit for lots of armies to deal with. Boss Zagstruk is just a fast and fighty Goths character, works quite well to leap around and tear stuff apart with his vulture claws, and the Smasher Squig Knob is an interesting minor melee character, often taking the melee kill chopper and then charging in with a bunch of mortal wounds plus quality attacks from that. Finally, and just outside the rankings, is the Warboss on Warbike from Forge World. 9 lists took that guy, and all as a secondary pick compared with another Warboss using the heroic support stratagem. He is really quite a good datasheet, really fast, and he can take some nice generic relics on him like the Killer Claw for his Power Claw. Though most lists don't want him as a primary choice, as they usually want to build around a War, not a speed War. In any case, despite not making it into the top 10, all of these guys do seem to be pretty usable in top armies. Getting into the list proper though, and at joint 10th place we have the trusty Battlewagon. 11 lists took at least one of these, and all of them used the standard Battlewagon profile as opposed to the Gun Wagon or the Bonebreaker. They're kind of badly balanced at the moment, with the Battlewagon just being a lot more efficient by costing far less but giving you similar sort of results. The Orky Battlewagon is an 105 point base, toughness 7 vehicle, with really quite an impressive 16 wounds. For that cost it really is very tanky indeed, plus gets Ramshackle as well for extra defense against low strength attacks. It does have a rather enormous transport capacity as well, having up to 20 models, meaning that it's quite a good one for putting in things like bulky Mega Nobz, or even multiple units with characters. Orc armies and transport seem to be really quite popular these days. They've got quite a lot of units that are kind of slow and a little bit fragile to enemy shooting, so could use a ride. Perhaps some of the top things to fill out battle wagons were units like Nobz, Mega Nobz, Burner Boys, regular boys and beast snaggers, plus bosses and perhaps a Weirdboy or two. For transports, they definitely had a bit of competition with the kill rig being taken a little bit more, as we'll talk about in a second. In general, for fielding the Battlewagon, the usual build tends to just be buying a death roller for an extra 15 points. That turns it from being just a dedicated transport into something that can actually deal a fair amount of damage itself. Usually around 5 hits at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 2 should flatten a Space Marine or 2 at the very least. Otherwise, the vast majority of the other gun upgrades just really aren't all that worth it for the extra cost, with the Orky Ballistic skill of 5+. A couple of lists either use the Fortress on Wheels custom job or the Ard case for a little bit of extra durability though, as that does actually contribute to its primary purpose. It's really quite a nice staging point for some fearsome Orky melee. In joint 10th with the Battlewagon, and also appearing in 11 out of these 25 top lists, we have the Nobz squad. I'd argue that in terms of datasheets, these guys were perhaps one of the very biggest winners in Arks of Omen with the points changes. They were already kind of usable before, and notably did well in the list that came second at the Las Vegas Open. But in Arks of Omen, their claws and swords were discounted, and the big choppers became entirely free. The Nobz are 17 points per model, strength and toughness 5 at base, 2 wounds and 3 attacks with a 4+ save. And then in terms of combat weapons, there really was a big mix of things like big choppers, power claws, and kill saws being run throughout the unit. I think all of them are fairly well balanced. You can take all of those primary weapons with an additional chopper as well, so you get an extra attack with that. That usually tends to be better than having an extra slugger. Generally, these guys tended to be taken in fairly biggish units, usually something with enough critical mass to really threaten whatever they were charging. Some of them use that Trukk Boyz upgrade, so using a truck to absolutely catapult them up the board and get a charge on something really, really far away. Though I feel that at least some army lists maybe had a bit of competition with them with Kommandos, which are also really popular, which might limit how many squads of these you wanted to take. Hard to go too far wrong though, these guys seem like pretty efficient damage dealers jumping out of battle wagons or trucks. Moving upwards, in joint 8th place, Weirdboys were taken in 14 lists, so these were taken in over half of top Orky armies. Weirdboys are fairly basic psychers, 70 points per model with strength and toughness 5. They hit in combat with a Weirdboy staff, which is okay but not standout, and they can either cast 1 or 2 powers each turn, depending on whether or not there's enough Orks nearby to them to generate the second one. The powers most people tend to go for are a +1 attack from Warpath. That one's very usable on just about any Ork unit. Particularly units like Stormboyz, Nobz and Squighogs will all like those quite a bit. The jump is pretty excellent as well for just boosting your unit all over the board. You can use it with combat units to get an unlikely charge on something that the enemy thought was safe, get line of sight with a shooting unit potentially, or just boost a unit onto an objective that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to reach and gain some board control. Those two tend to be the most popular, but the Fists of Gork one is also pretty usable as well. If you've got an absolutely tooled up fighty boss, then an extra couple of pips of strength and attacks can make them into even more of a melee monster with something like brutal but cunning. For Orky Psychic, the Weirdboys just massively outcompete the Warboss. No one's using them as their discipline's kind of underwhelming. A few of their powers do turn up on kill rigs though, which are far more popular. In joint 8th with the Weirdboys, and also taken in 14 lists, are the Boar Cavalry Squighog Boyz. These are chunky Ork damage dealers with some fairly impressive stats. 25 points for a 10-inch moving monster. Toughness 6, 3 wounds and a 4+ save on defense, which really isn't too bad. They have a tiny bit of shooting with their sticker spear, but more importantly a whole flurry of damage to attacks in combat between the sticker and the attacks of the Squighog itself. People generally tended to take them in units of 5 models, a few lists ran just 3s of them, and bomb squigs are kind of usable at just 5 points, a chance to deal out a few mortal wounds to a nearby unit. Their raw numbers are quite good, though they do have a little bit of an issue with things like terrain and morale. Being cavalry, it means that they can't just ghost through walls like infantry can, and only being leadership 6 is particularly poor even by Ork standards. They do have a bit of competition as well for the also popular Stormboyz in the fast attack section. If you're not building around Arks of Omen fast attack, then these guys might be pressured out a little bit by the Stormboyz. Still though, they've got a whole load going for them. Very decent melee, okay speed and okay defense. Hard to go too far wrong with that. Moving upwards into some fairly seriously popular Ork units, in 7th place we have the trusty Trukk, a 70-point dedicated transport with toughness 6, 10 wounds and ramshackle. Not really too fancy here. It moves 12 inches, it's open topped for a little bit of shooting out of it if you need, and it does have a fairly reasonable transport capacity, allowing you to take 10 boys plus a character or 2. Again with the Battlewagon, common selections for this one are things like Nobz squads, Boys, Beastnagger Boys and Mega Nobz. Perhaps a little bit more skews towards the units that just want to be catapulted straight at the enemy and then ditch out into melee. Generally people didn't tend to bother with the upgrades for this, like the Wrecking Ball or the Grabbing Claw, and the main reason that people did usually tend to take this one is due to the existence of Trukk Boyz, the specialist mob where you can basically move this thing, then have the unit get out, move and charge. In the War it means that you can have an infantry unit out of a truck just cover a crazy distance across the table, averaging charges of something like 30 odd inches. I think that was the main reason that a whole load of lists just chose to include just literally one truck like this. A couple of lists had two, but no one went too mad on them. They generally tended to be a bit of an extra on top of things like battle wagons and kill rigs. Speaking of which, in 6th place we've got the kill rig. We're getting into units that are taking a serious amount in these top orc lists now. This was taken in almost 80% of them. The kill rig is Games Workshop's latest big beast snagger centerpiece, 190 points worth of tanky transport. This one just does a little bit of everything, having OK toughness at toughness 8 and 16 wounds, a bit of shooting even if a bit inaccurate, fairly decent melee for the cost to be honest. It's pretty fast with a 12-inch move, though the big base might struggle with terrain just a little bit. It gets psychic powers from the beast head disciplines such as Frazzle, which is quite nice on a big base. It's got a nice stratagem with the heavy lobber to slow down a unit if it's really important to debuff an enemy Death Star. And finally, and perhaps one of the most important draws, is that it transports the boys up to battle. These things don't generally tend to be run empty at the moment and are usually full of beast snagger boys. Overall, it's definitely a model that's got a lot going on. Perhaps other interesting things are that you could quite reasonably get a first turn charge out of it if you need it, maybe give it the squig hide tires, and then because it counts as a character model, you can advance and charge it with the War. For psychic powers, typical picks often tended to be Frazzle for the big area of effect mortal wounds on the big base, or perhaps Squiggly Curse for a bit of focused witchfire. As a character, you can also potentially give it relics if you want to, like those scorched git bones, but the majority of armies generally seem to leave that off. With quite so much going on with them, they're usually going to be fairly high priority threats for your opponents to take down. It does seem that kill rigs alongside battle wagons are a pretty popular thing to maintain the orc battle line though, and deliver the orc combat units into melee. Staying with some of the more auto-include units at the moment, we've got the Stormboyz in 5th. These were taken in 80% of lists, and the Stormboyz are the fun militaristic boys that jump up 12 inches with a great big rocket strapped to their back, and then fight in combat just as any other normal boy would, loads of strength 4 attacks with their choppers. Perhaps their single most interesting thing is their full throttle rule to allow them to automatically advance 6 inches. That's really big on the turn that you call the War with the advance and charge, so you know that you're going to be able to get 18-inch movement guaranteed out of these guys before charging with a reroll after that. It's a lot more viable compared with previous Orc codexes, only having a single coin flip chance to take a mortal wound from it. In the fast attack selections, people tend to take a good mix of both 5 strong and 10 strong Orc units. The 5 strong ones are maybe a bit better for skirmishing over objectives and maybe being a bit more sacrificial and trying to hide out of line of sight, maybe jumping on some light infantry if they think that they can gain the upper hand easily. Lots of people do just use them as mainline damage dealers though, usually taking squads of around about 10 boys, often throwing in a power claw to give them a little bit more threat against harder targets, and smashing them into the enemy to tear up enemy infantry. I feel like they're a unit that's quite good in both Goths and Death Skulls. I really like the Goths melee bonuses, and they're quite relevant in Death Skulls as well, getting objectives secured on them which can throw a crazy distance in one turn, plus they'll like the rerolls for power claws. Overall a very strong Orc unit, boys that get there quick. Ranked in 4th place we've got the Mighty Orc Warbosses, again near enough auto-includes to take one variant of them or the other, and 21 lists choose to take these out of the 25. For this one I have included beast bosses in with that number, which are basically just variant war bosses to all intents and purposes, but not speed bosses like the Warboss on Warbike or the Deathkiller Wartrike. In general, Orc bosses are just kind of necessary to running an Orc army at the moment. They're the models that allow you to call the War for the big advance and charge and the huge melee buffs when you get there, plus also invul saves to keep your units safe as they move up. With the balance of Orc units at the moment, it just outcompetes the Speed War by a whole load. And actually, if you included Ghazghkull Thraka in the war bosses, then literally every single Orc list ran a war boss of some description. It's just some of them happened to be Ghazghkull Thraka instead, making use of his Great War, and then he was backed up by other HQ choices. Besides that, out of the various flavours of War Boss and Beast Boss, the single most popular was still the Beast Boss on the Squigosaur, just an all-round general massive combatant, 160 points for a very tanky character with 9 wounds and -1 damage at toughness 7, and then some quality melee attacks between his beast chopper and the big Squigosaur's jaws, which can have the chance to deal out a bunch of mortal wounds. Things like the combo of Beast Hide Mantle and Arda's Nails are particularly popular on him, increases his already massive durability there, but the combination of brutal but cunning and a fighty relic like the Killer Claw or the Edwhopper's Kill Chopper are both good on other bosses. Both the standard Orc Warboss and the Mega Boss were popular too, though the brutal but cunning combo is quite popular on the Warboss on Warbike. Talking of which, the bosses seem to be so good that quite a lot of lists are buying in more than one of them. Lots of armies choose to partake of that heroic support stratagem to get a second boss on the table. Often there was a standard war boss leading the way, and then buying in the speed boss on the warbike. He could often be the second one, so you could still have his fast-moving melee profile, but you didn't have to pass up on the war. Overall, basically at the moment, top-tier orc lists tend to build around the war for the big melee, and usually you want at least one flavour of war boss, whether it's one of the more standard ones or Ghazghkull Thraka himself. Next up, and nice to see them back in the battle line of the army pretty solidly, are the boys. Again, for this one I thought it made sense to combine the Beast Snagger Boys and the regular boys profiles here. Very similar units with just a few minor differences. They're both objective secured aggressive orcs with a flurry of AP-1 attacks on the charge. They like falling out of transports, whether it's battle wagons or kill rigs, and putting the hurt on the enemy. I feel like both of them have become a lot more viable again since their points decrease in Nephilim, plus also Armour of Contempt going away means mass AP-1 attacks are far more viable against the whole field. Out of the two units, the Beast Snagger Boys are currently quite a lot more popular than regular boys, despite being 10 points versus 8 on the standard ones. For the upgrade, you get the 6+ invul save, an extra pip of strength, a bonus rule to be a bit better against vehicles, and the Power Snapper included on the unit's knob for free. I think another big draw to them are some slightly improved stratagems, plus the ability to be taken in a kill rig as well, and those things are pretty efficient transports that are locked to only taking Beast Snagger units in them. The regular boys aren't quite as common, only 7 lists taking those versus 21. A lot of armies included a mix of the two, but again usually the emphasis tended to be on the Beast Snaggers rather than the standard boys. Otherwise, in terms of unit size and equipment, it's basically 10 model squads without exception. No real massive point in building out higher with orcs at the moment, unfortunately. Their morale rules are pretty punitive, and they don't have that many stratagems that can affect really big units. Again, maybe a foot slogging mob or two to hide behind terrain isn't the worst, but other units tend to do that a bit better. They really like to be falling out of transports, whether it's kill rigs, but they can also use trucks or wagons equally. It's nice to see boys back as a staple part of the battle line though. I feel like Games Workshop did get it quite wrong when the Orc Codex came out, and they were kind of niche and rarely taken. Moving on from units that are pretty much auto-includes to are almost universally taken, we've got the Kommandos. The fun stealthy skirmish orcs were taken in a crazy 24 out of the 25 top performing orc armies. They're basically an 11 points elite's choice with the profile of standard orc boys, sluggers and choppers, and they can set up in the midfield where they like to be in terrain if possible. Their sneaky gits rule means that they're actually genuinely quite hard to shoot down if they're in light cover. They get an additional +2 to their armor save, so they'd usually be saving on a 3+ in light cover, and that's really not bad given a toughness 5 profile. In combat as well, they can potentially hit really quite a lot harder than standard boys. Throat Slitters gives them an extra +1 to wound if they're right next to a terrain feature. It's a pretty huge combat buff if you can coordinate it, though it's not always going to be possible. And then they've got access to a crazy amount of gear, a lot of which is locked to 10 model units and is sometimes overcosted. I'd say perhaps the pick of all that gear might be the Power Claw for a cheap 5 points extra, cheaper than it normally is, and the Bomb Squig for 5 points for some mortal wounds handed out. Some of the other stuff is pretty usable though. The Breacher Ram and the Distraction Grot I think are both fine as well. It does seem that the vast majority of Orky armies these days work pretty well with 2 or 3 units of these. Some people take them in units of 5 just for objective securing nuisance units, and ones that the opponent can't really ignore with the damage that they can do to light infantry at least, and some build out into bigger 10-block squads. Potentially with an early war they could be charging right into the opponent's deployment zone straight from turn 1 and cause them problems and lock their army there. They're pretty awesome in 2 of the most popular clans in Goths and Death Skulls. The exploding 6s and the +1 strength, in addition to that +1 to wound that they might get, is pretty nice in Goths, and for Death Skulls they get objective secured as well, pretty handy on any unit that you can put down in the midfield, and particularly one that's not all that easy to kill at shooting. Overall, basically a top tier orc unit at the moment. fairly efficient raw damage and defense, and excellent for helping out with both primary objectives and secondaries, things like Green Tide and doing actions. Finally though, and arguably the most auto-include Orc competitive unit right now, is kind of hilariously none other than the lowly Gretchin, which were taken in literally every single one of the 25 top performing Orc lists that I looked at. I feel like the usual saying of boys winning fights but grots winning games still applies very much here. Just about every list taking a decent amount of Gretchin, usually 2 or 3 units appears to be the sweet spot for most people, a couple taking a bit more or a bit less. Gretchin are 4 points per model and don't really do a fat lot besides just being models to shunt around and do grunt work. They don't really do that much damage with a little bit of close range pistol fire, but their durability actually isn't all that bad when they're just 4 points per model. Toughness 3 with the potential for a 5+ saving cover is alright. They do have pretty massive leadership issues though. A leadership of 4 means they basically fail morale just about whenever one's killed, and cowardly means that more run away from combat attrition too. Even despite that though, just causing a few chip casualties on the unit isn't going to make all of them run away. There's still going to be at least a few left to annoyingly survive unless you literally focus lots of fire on them, which you don't normally want to do. For just 40 points for a fairly big unit for a bit of board control, Gretchin really are quite nice. They're excellent action doers and are maybe particularly used for the get the good bits action, the one that they can complete on midfield objectives in just one turn. They're pretty handy for just sitting around hidden on home field objectives as well, somewhere that they'll ideally be safe, or doing other grunt work like screening out areas from deep strike, having a fairly wide footprint on the board if you need them to. For the way that they're taken, generally people don't take runt herds, it's usually just better to run more grots for that same cost, and they tend to be taken in units of 10, again due to leadership and having more value in more random scattered units on the board, some of which can hide in different annoying places. A few lists that weren't making use of Truckboyz made use of Horrible Gits for some objectives secured on one unit of them. Could be a good objective camping one. In general, seems to be a good time for the diminutive greenskins, even if their lot in life still seems to be just doing all the grunt work and a fair bit of the dying. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed a bit of discussion around the top Orky units in Warhammer 40k right now. Look forward to hearing any of your takes and the way that you've been using these in the game at the moment. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like it, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. If you'd like to see another Orky video, then I'll leave a link to my Ork Nobz video, that's linked in the video description below. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description as well. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.